Thanks. So far, what we've heard is some of the sort of hopeful notions of immigration and its impacts on economic growth, and along with it, some of the challenges. What I want to do is set out a framework, very simple framework, for thinking about the various kinds of issues that are raised in thinking about economic impacts of immigration. I'm going to then use that framework in conjunction with the broad empirical evidence in the economics literature in general and in the labor economics literature in particular to argue that the net economic impact of immigration is in fact zero. I actually view that as a good outcome. Only an economist could see a zero as a positive, I think. But and the reason for that is if you look in these literatures, there is very little, and I'm certainly willing to be corrected on this, but to my reading, there's very little in the way of credible empirical papers that come out with a big positive impact on economic growth. Most of the debate is between zero or negative. My feeling is that the evidence weighs in around zero, and what that means is that then we're free to look at immigration in the way that we've already been hearing about, immigration as a nation-building process. We can see it as something that has neutral economic impacts, and that means then we are free to move on and think about it in terms of nation building. And my personal feeling is that it's a very positive force in nation building and in democracy in general. So I'm actually, this may surprise you given the line I just said, but I'm actually very pro-immigration, but not for economic reasons. So let me just sort of launch right in. The first thing that I need to do is talk about what economic outcomes I'm referring to. And the first point is I want to talk about intensive economic growth, that is growth in output per person rather than extensive growth. So as a first argument, my guess is most people here would agree with this. We don't care about the growth in total GDP or total employment except to the extent that it has impacts on people through outcomes like impacts on their wage rates or the employment rate. The second point is, and this point's already been raised by all three people before me, when we're talking about a factor as large and as important as immigration, we should be thinking about it primarily in terms of an outcome like nation building, or to put it in a slightly different way, in terms of social justice. Economic growth or economic impacts are then instrumental towards those kinds of outcomes. And because of that, and because of my personal notion of what I view as a goal for a socially just society, I'm going to put most emphasis on impacts on the low-skilled labor market as we go along. Okay. So I'm going to use the world's simplest framework for thinking about what's going on. I'm just going to talk about a simple demand and supply framework for an unskilled labor market. So immigration is going to be a shift in supply, a shift out in supply in this labor market. And what kind of impacts it's going to have are going to depend on the location and the slope of the demand curve. And it's important to recognize that that demand curve, if we draw any demand curve, we draw it implicitly holding constant a bunch of essentially everything else, right? So the supply of other factors, so capital, for example, skilled labor, entrepreneurial talent, what the technology is, that is, I'm going to basically hold innovation constant for the moment, the institutional environment that might affect job creation. Okay, then if we go to the sort of simple diagram, we've got demand and supply defining some wage and employment level in the labor market. Immigration is a shift out in the supply curve, and at the moment, holding constant everything else that I talked about, holding constant, the implication would be a drop in the wage rate and an increase in employment. And notice that's total employment. The outcome on the employment rate is sort of more uncertain. It's probably somewhat negative. Okay? Now, much of what we've already heard, and much of, it seems to me, the debate about immigration actually has to do with what comes next. Most of the kinds of factors that are raised in talking about immigration and economic growth is the notion that, in fact, immigration does more than shift the supply curve out. It actually, in effect, shifts the demand curve. Okay? So that if we, for example, one common route that's discussed is immigrants help form stronger trade links. Okay? If there are stronger trade links, that would imply increases in demand, a shift out in the demand curve. Then the question is, If it shifts out, if these factors shift the demand curve out less than proportionally than the supply curve, then we'll still be in a world with lower wage rates. If it shifts it out more than proportionally, we will end up in a world that often seems to be discussed, which is rising, higher wage rates and employment rates. I've drawn it I got to draw it, so I get to draw it my way. So I've drawn it as having essentially a neutral impact. So what I want to do now is kind of walk through some notions of what immigration does in terms of economic growth, that is, how it might be shifting this demand curve. Okay? The first one, which we've already heard several times now, is the notion that immigrants fill occupational gaps, quote unquote. So this is a notion that, say, if we didn't have enough engineers, we can't take advantage of certain modern technologies. If there's not enough pipe fitters in Fort McMurray, we won't actually be able to take whatever is in the oil sands out of the oil sands if we want to do that. And then a special case of this is this sort of notion that sometimes comes up, is that immigrants will do jobs that Canadians, quote unquote, won't do, or people who've arrived before, quote unquote, won't do. Where there's this sort of notion that if these jobs aren't done, something bad happens as a consequence. In my mind, this is a notion of the economy where you view the economy as something like an engine. And any part, no matter how smart or how dirty, if it's missing, eventually the engine will fail. Right? And therefore, we need to fill these crucial gaps, or else we won't get economic growth. And by filling them, we enable economic growth. For most economists, when they hear the word occupational gap, they will tell you that that's an incomplete sentence. I don't actually know what that means. It has to be finished with an occupational gap at a particular wage. All right? Now, that then raises the question of exactly how an economy really functions. Right? Economists like markets not because we really like fierce competition. We don't have, rooster fights in our backyard in the evenings for entertainment because there's not enough competition in front of us, right? We like markets and we like prices because they're an amazing allocational mechanism. They are a way of decentralizing huge decisions, right? So when there are these quote-unquote gaps at the going wage, what happens is those wages get bid up, and there are a whole series of responses that then happen. People choose to get skills they otherwise would not have chosen to get. People choose to move across Canada that they might otherwise not have chosen, moves they might otherwise not chosen to make, right? And the key question then is, why do we want to stop that? What is it that makes us think that we need to bring some inflow in right at that moment to prevent those other adjustments, to prevent those, say, wage increases, right? It is not, I would contend, a disaster if Tim Hortons in Fort McMurray has to raise its wages. When it raises its wages, it then has to raise its coffee prices and maybe goes out of business. If it goes out of business under those circumstances, the reason is because the price mechanism was such that those resources were bid away to something else. Those workers will be employed where they have a greater value to the economy, essentially, as given by the price system, right? So now, the government has, at least in the past, disagreed with that. The temporary foreign worker program included fast tracking of food service workers in Alberta and BC. I think the key point here is that the model that the economy works like an engine with possibly missing parts is not the right model. An economy is more like an organic whole that reacts through innovation and through price signals. And stopping those price signals is something we have to think hard about. And a very good example of this comes from work by Garnet-Pico and Feng Hu, who looked at the engineering labor market around 2000 in Canada, when there was a notion that we needed more engineers. There still is. That was being addressed by immigration policy. It was also being addressed by education policy, and the end result was a glut of engineers with all kinds of problems for people from both sides, right? There has to be more thought given to the what economists call the general equilibrium effects. Second, so there's another possible mode through which immigration raises the demand curve in the low-skilled labor market or in any labor market. The notion that bringing in skills in some sense complements low-skilled labor. So if I bring in a carpenter, then I now need unskilled workers to work with that carpenter. If I bring in an engineer, that means more projects that run and therefore more demand for other types of workers. Okay? Now the question of whether these effects really exist or how large they are is the evidence on this is extremely mixed in the economic literature. So the closest literature is actually in urban labor markets. So Acemoglu and Angrist, looking across urban labor markets, find no impact of raising the average education level in an economy on low-skilled wages. Moretti finds a positive impact of raising the proportion of people who have a university degree on low-skilled wages, but then Sand finds that that actually only occurred in the 1980s. In other work with Paul Beaudry, what we found is that, in fact, it's quite possible that raising the skill level actually has a negative impact on unskilled wages. And it has that impact because firms are now choosing between using a very skill-intensive technology to do something or very unskilled intensive. So they choose, now with more skilled workers around, they choose ways of doing things that use more skilled workers, effectively taking capital out of the hands of unskilled workers. But in any case, whether this is an impact or not, whether this is a very positive impact is at least up in the air. Immigrants bring capital. Okay, so this is part of the notion. So again, we could shift that demand curve out if we brought in more physical capital. If immigrants brought in more physical capital, it's part of the notion behind the investor program. Now, if the world supply of capital was perfectly elastic, that program would do nothing, right? You can count ever many dollars you want, it will have no impact. And my personal belief is that that's not quite true, that there is some inelasticity, that there is some sort of stickiness of capital to where people who own the capital live. But again, the question is not whether there's negative impacts. It's not. My question for you is the positive impact big enough to offset that shift out in supply? Is it positive? Is it big enough to bring us to much higher levels of wages and employment rates? Immigrants open trade links. There's interesting papers by Keith Head and John Reese from UBC who say, yes, they do open trade links. Most of the impacts are, in fact, on imports. Again, if this is a positive impact on demand, the question is, how big a positive demand? Right? How big an effect? Immigrants bring entrepreneurial talent. I think it's without question that there are, substantial numbers of very successful immigrant entrepreneurs. It's easy to find those cases. The question is, are they coming in more than proportionally to the rest of the immigrant inflow? And again, in some other work with Paul Beaudry and Ben Sand, what we've found is that they've come in roughly proportionally. So in other words, you're bringing in lots of immigrants, you're also bringing in lots of entrepreneurs, but it's not the case that you're bringing in a hugely disproportionate number of entrepreneurs ultimately. Okay? And again, that would then point to what is essentially a neutral. I'm not going to do that one. Okay, so what's the net impact? So let me just talk briefly about a few studies. So possibly the most famous study in this area in economics is a study by David Card, who's at Berkeley and who actually happens to be a Canadian, an emigrant instead of an immigrant. Around 1980, Castro opened the doors and let a whole bunch of people leave and head for the U.S. And they all, the people that were open for, got out for as long as the door was open, ended up in Miami. The Miami labor force increased by 7% in the course of about a month, 2 months. Taking that data and looking up to 3 years out, what he found was that the wage rate in the Miami economy and the employment rate in the Miami economy were unchanged, okay? Including looking at, for example, he focused on the poor black community and still unchanged, all right? So in some sense, what happens is you bring in this big immigrant inflow and the economy more or less replicates itself. Okay? You end up back at wages and employment rates that are similar to where you were. Now, George Borjas, who's many of you probably has heard his name, did not like this outcome. So he then constructed studies looking at the national level, looking at what is the impact within a skill group defined by experience or education of inflows of immigrants. He argued that, in fact, the impact was negative on wages, but if you look hard at what he's saying, his estimates imply a very elastic demand curve. In other words, there's maybe a negative impact, but it's not a very big negative impact. So I actually read his things as close to zero. Giovanni Perry and co-authors have done sort of a much better job than Borjas, in my mind, in looking at these and allowing for immigrants, the possibility of immigrants bringing much different skills. But still, the impact, if you read the final lines of his papers, the impact is essentially zero. Okay, and then in work again with